As we closed out Independence Day weekend, there has been a lot of conversations over these past few days on the Founding Fathers and the birth of this great nation. Everyone knows about the sacrifices made during the Revolutionary War and the battles of Lexington and Concord, Yorktown, and the Saratoga Campaign. Many marvel at the genius that was the Declaration of Independence and the great men who helped write it. Maybe some of you even watched the movies Patriot or Johnny Tremaine like I did. So as most have discussed the revolution against the British and the great history of this uniquely amazing country, I would like to talk about a more modern-day antithesis to the principles that America was founded on. During this Independence Day, my thoughts went to the people who, even today, know nothing but dependence. Minorities, and especially an above-average number in the African American community, have mired for decades in poverty. Slavery, while it was spread all over the world at the time, and it even exists today, but we ended it almost 150 years ago on December 18, 1865. It was a Republican president who began the Civil War to end slavery. It was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that was enforced after the surrender of the Confederate Army that started the countdown to the last days of this despicable practice. It was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that abolished slavery altogether, all done by a Republican president and his party. Booker T. Washington was one of the last black leaders that was born into slavery. Washington was a Republican, and while he was for civil rights for blacks, he was weary of alienating white Southern Democrats by fighting the sickening racist Jim Crow segregation laws that were written by Democrats at the state and local level. The first president to invite Booker T. Washington to the White House was Republican Teddy Roosevelt. Washington worked closely with the National Republican Party leaders and was often asked for advice by President Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, another Republican. His message was not so much to fight Jim Crow, though he secretly supported court challenges to segregation. He created and activated a nationwide coalition of middle-class blacks, black church leaders, and white philanthropists, as well as Republican politicians, with a long-term goal of building the black community's economic strength and pride by a focus on self-help and schooling. Sounds like the modern-day Republican Party as well. The Democrats' ferociously racist history is well known, as the Ku Klux Klan was created by Democrats back in 1865 in an immediate response to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. This sick and twisted racism was continued for generations, even up until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Giving civil rights to blacks was fought tooth and nail by Democrats in Congress, but their leader, Democrat President Lyndon Johnson, saw an opportunity. As the South was changing to be more Republican, he was worried about the future of his party. Although since Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave the country the first taste of dependence on government handouts, LBJ wanted to take it to the next level. Since FDR, blacks were identifying themselves more and more with Democrats. While the South was slipping away, Johnson had to look to Republicans on Capitol Hill to pass the Civil Rights Act, as over a third of Democrats in D.C. were still anti-black racists. Without the help of Senate Minority Leader Republican Everett Dirksen, civil rights would not have passed. It wasn't until Johnson's insidious plan to ferment decades of dependence of the African American community on Democrat handouts was hidden in LBJ's phony war on poverty that blacks began voting overwhelmingly Democrat. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was so proud of his achievement at creating a black dependent class that he was famously quoted in award-winning and New York Times bestseller Ron Kessler's book, Inside the White House, as saying, quote, "I'll have those blacks voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Of course, the rampant racist Johnson used the N-word instead of blacks. So following the lead of their racist president in the mid-1960s, the racist Democrats changed their tactics. They turned in their sheets and pointy hats for the most insidious and deviously stealth racism of all, economic suppression. With the militant black leader Malcolm X, they still had a voice that could see through the smokescreen of the Democrats' insidious plan of economic oppression to keep blacks voting Democrat. He famously said in Cleveland on April 3, 1964,
"The party that you bash controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
Listen to it again and think about what would be different if the exact same thing was said today. Nothing would be different. In the top 10 cities that have the highest black poverty in the nation, all have been run by Democrat mayors for at least since the late 80s, like Cleveland and Cincinnati. Detroit, that just went bankrupt with runaway poverty in black areas, has not had a Republican mayor since 1961. Miami and El Paso have never had a Republican mayor. Newark, New Jersey, with way above average poverty for its African American community, has not had a Republican mayor since 1907. Now, if you look at the national level, I bet most of you out there don't know that over the last 40 years, black unemployment was lowest under the supposed racist George W. Bush. And take a wild guess under whose presidency in the last 40 years was black unemployment highest? Under the first black president, Barack Obama. And with a disastrous record on jobs for the African American community, with his laser-like focus only on re-election, what did he say to a conference of the Congressional Black Caucus in 2011?
Take off your bedroom slippers. Put on your marching shoes. Shake it off. Stop complaining. Stop grumbling. Stop crying.
With unemployment and poverty crushing the black community, Obama is only worried about getting people out in the streets to help him secure another 4 years. For what? More misery in the black inner cities? More black youth unemployment over 40%? Even in this week's unemployment numbers, after $1 trillion spent in 2009 to fix the economy, there is insanely high black unemployment at 10.7%. That's twice that of white Americans. While it's a stretch to call President Obama racist, he is obviously a traitor to his race. He obviously cares more about his 1%er white donors than the millions of blacks who voted for him into office, especially the second time in 2012, where he beat Mitt Romney by only 335,000 votes. And what was their reward? 10.7 unemployment and oppressive poverty. But hey, if you're black and in poverty in America, just stop complaining and grumbling about your situation. Just like Booker T. Washington back around the turn of the century, today's Republicans also believe in the long-term goal of building the black community's economic strength and pride by a focus on self-help and schooling. Democrats of today are more about the voting bloc of the African American community, depending on government handouts and empty promises to keep them in power. They also use the tried and true race card to keep blacks from straying from the Democrat plantation. While Democrats like to muddy the waters and call George W. Bush a racist or point to Republican Richard Nixon's imaginary Southern strategy, this supposed racist strategy was debunked in Bruce Bartlett's book Wrong on Race. Not only was this a fallacy created by Democrats, but a lefty New York Times commentator admitted that Nixon's role on civil rights was very good, and Nixon, at one point, had even said we should have race reparations. After decades of empty promises from Democrats for a better life under their rule, the African American community still votes overwhelmingly a straight Democrat ticket. While the younger generation of blacks are slowly moving away from the Democrat Party, most of us on the right keep wondering when will the black community finally see through the decades of empty promises on the left and look at history and facts, not rhetoric, as to who really was and is today looking out for their best interests. The great Thomas Sowell summed it up perfectly when he said, quote, "The assumption that spending more of the taxpayer money will make things better has survived all kinds of evidence that it has made things worse. The black family which survived slavery, discrimination, poverty, wars, and depression began to come apart as the federal government moved in with its well-financed programs to help." Unquote. In my opinion, the day of reckoning just might be around the corner. And this day will be brought about by who? The first black president of the United States, Barack Obama. Not only because of his abysmal record on improving black Americans' lives, which is the worst in over 40 years with record poverty and misery not seen in a generation. But it is the latest hot-button issue and Democrat obsession, immigration reform that will send the black vote moving to the right. Obama and the Democrat Party are ready to abandon the black voting bloc for a bigger one, the Hispanic vote. Will this betrayal of the African American community by the Democrats after 50 years of blind support send major numbers back to the Republican Party, where they all started when Republicans gave their ancestors their freedom from Democrat oppression? Only time will tell, and the clock is ticking.